3 days after I lost my baby, I opened Facebook to distract myself for 5 minutes and found my mother's post at the top of my feed. A photo of me from Christmas, a paragraph about praying for healing, and 200 comments from people I barely knew, offering condolences for a loss I hadn't told any of them about yet. She hadn't asked me. She hadn't warned me. She'd taken the worst moment of my life and turned it into content for an audience of her own friends, because the sympathy she received in the comments mattered more to her than my right to grieve privately. My name is Hannah. I was 29 years old, and what I did next wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure something like this could never happen to me, or to anyone else in my family, ever again. If you've ever had someone take your pain and make it about themselves, I think you'll understand exactly why I did what I did. This story deals with pregnancy loss. I want to tell it honestly, but also gently, because I know some of you listening have lived through something similar, and you deserve a story that treats that experience with care, not spectacle. If this isn't something you're up for hearing today, that's completely okay. Take care of yourself first. My mother, Carol, has always needed to be the center of every story, even stories that weren't hers to tell. Growing up, I remember her narrating our family's hardships to anyone who would listen. My brother's learning disability, my parents' brief separation when I was 12, my own struggles with anxiety in high school, always framed in a way that positioned her as the strong, suffering matriarch, holding everything together, rather than simply as a mother supporting her kids through difficult things quietly, the way most parents do. I used to think this was just how she processed stress, a coping mechanism, harmless in its own way. It took me years to understand that it wasn't really about processing anything. It was about attention, about being seen as resilient, as devoted, as a woman who sacrificed everything for her family, in front of an audience of friends and relatives who would respond with exactly the kind of sympathy and admiration she seemed to need constantly, from somewhere outside herself. I'm sharing this context not to villainize her entirely, because I don't think she ever set out to hurt me intentionally. I think, in her mind, sharing difficult things publicly was simply how she'd always coped, and it never occurred to her, even once, that the people the stories were actually about might not want them told at all. I was married to my husband Josh for 2 years when we found out I was pregnant. We were careful about who we told, waiting past the first trimester the way a lot of people do, wanting a little more certainty before opening ourselves up to everyone else's excitement. We told my parents early, against the general advice, because my mother had a talent for sensing when something was being withheld from her, and honestly, at the time, it felt easier to include her than to manage the fallout of her feeling excluded. I asked her directly, in that conversation, "Please don't post about this yet. We want to wait until we're further along." She agreed. She said, "Of course, sweetheart. This is your news to share." I lost the pregnancy 11 weeks later. I don't want to describe this part in detail, because I don't think the details are anyone's business but mine, and honestly, that's the entire point of this story. What I'll say is that it happened over the course of a difficult weekend, that Josh was with me through all of it, and that by Monday, I was physically recovering and emotionally in a place I don't think I have adequate words for. Even now, I told my parents the same day, because I wanted them to know before they asked how the pregnancy was progressing, and because despite everything, I still believed, at that point, that my mother understood the difference between being told something in confidence and being given permission to share it. She called me that evening, tearful, saying all the right things. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm here for you. Whatever you need. I remember feeling grateful for that call. I remember thinking, for a few days at least, that this was a moment where she'd finally show up the way I needed her to. Quietly, privately, just for me. I was wrong. 3 days later, still on medical leave from work, still barely able to get through a full day without needing to lie down from exhaustion and grief, I opened Facebook, mostly out of boredom, looking for some small distraction from my own thoughts. Her post was near the top of my feed. A photo of me from the previous Christmas, smiling, healthy, with a caption that read, almost word for word, "Please keep my daughter in your prayers this week. She's going through the hardest thing a mother can experience, and as her mom." My heart is shattered right alongside hers. We will get through this as a family, the way we always do. Underneath it, over 200 comments. Prayer hands emojis. Sending love to your daughter. You're such a strong mom for sharing this. This must be so hard for you, Carol. People I recognized from her side of the family, people I'd never met. Co-workers of hers I'd only heard about in passing. All responding to a moment of my life I had explicitly asked her not to share, framed in a way that centered her own grief and strength, rather than even mentioning my name directly. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time before I could process what I was looking at. Not just the fact that she'd shared it, though that alone felt like a violation I didn't have words for yet, but the specific way she'd shared it. My loss had become an opportunity for her to receive comments calling her strong, resilient, a devoted mother. My grief had become the raw material for her own emotional performance, staged in front of an audience of nearly 300 people, none of whom I had chosen to include in the worst week of my life. I called her immediately. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage given the circumstances, to take the post down. She said, and I remember this precisely, "I just needed somewhere to put my own feelings about this too, honey. I didn't use any details. I was being respectful." She had used my photo. She had described the loss specifically enough that anyone who knew me could identify exactly what had happened. And she genuinely, I believe, did not understand why any of that constituted a violation. Because in her mind, her own emotional need to process publicly outweighed my explicit, stated wish for privacy. She did eventually take the post down, 3 hours after I asked, only after I told her Josh was going to call her himself if she didn't. But by then, over 200 people had already seen it, already commented, already screenshotted it in some cases, the way people sometimes do with emotional posts they find moving, without ever thinking about consent. Over the following 2 weeks, I found myself receiving condolence messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. A former college roommate. A second cousin I'd met twice. My mother's hairdresser, somehow, reached out through Instagram to say she was praying for my healing journey. Every message was well-intentioned. That's the part that made this so disorienting to process. Nobody messaging me was doing anything wrong from their perspective. They'd seen a mother asking for prayers for her grieving daughter, and they were responding with genuine compassion. The violation wasn't in their responses. It was in the fact that I'd never consented to being the subject of that post at all, and now I was fielding grief support from strangers for a loss I hadn't chosen to make public, while also managing the actual grief itself, which was hard enough without an audience. I asked my mother in a longer conversation about a week later to understand why this had hurt me so specifically. I tried to explain that grief needs privacy to actually be processed, that having strangers comment on my pain turned something sacred and painful into something observed, something performed, something that stopped fully belonging to me the moment it became content for her page. She cried during that conversation, genuinely, and told me she felt like I was accusing her of not caring about me, when really she'd only been trying to process her own pain as a grandmother who'd also lost something in that pregnancy. I understood, even in the moment, that her grief as a grandmother was real. I never disputed that. What I disputed, then and now, was her right to process that grief publicly, using my image, my story, my loss, without my permission, in a way that generated sympathy and admiration specifically directed at her. She didn't fully hear that distinction. She apologized for how it made me feel. A phrase that manages to sound like an apology while assigning the actual problem to my emotional reaction, rather than her actual behavior. She never apologized for the post itself. She never acknowledged that sharing it without permission was the actual violation, separate entirely from how I happened to feel about it afterward. I let it go, for a while, because I was exhausted, grieving, and didn't have the emotional capacity to fight a battle I sensed she wasn't capable of fully understanding yet. Then, 4 months later, she did it again. Josh and I decided to try again about 4 months after the loss, once I felt physically and emotionally ready, and once my doctor gave us the go-ahead. We didn't tell anyone this time. Not my parents, not my in-laws, nobody, specifically because of what had happened before. 6 weeks into that second pregnancy, still well within the window most people wait before announcing anything, I started spotting, and within 2 days, we learned we'd lost this pregnancy too. Because we hadn't told my parents I was even pregnant this time, I genuinely believed there was no way this loss could become public without my direct involvement. I was wrong again, in a way that finally forced me to act. My mother, it turned out, had seen a receipt for a doctor's office copay on a shared banking app my parents still had access to from years earlier, back when they'd helped us with wedding expenses, and we'd simply never removed the shared access afterward. She'd pieced together, correctly, that something medical was happening, and rather than asking me directly, she posted a vaguer version of the same kind of message, no specific details this time, clearly having learned that lesson at least, but still emotionally loaded enough that anyone who knew our history could read between the lines. Sending my daughter strength through something difficult right now. Some seasons test a mother's faith more than others. I found out about this post from my sister-in-law, who saw it and, confused, texted me asking if everything was okay, since she didn't know we'd even been trying again. That was the moment something in me shifted permanently. Not into anger exactly, into a clear, calm decision that I was done asking my mother to respect a boundary she had now crossed twice, in 2 different ways, each time treating my private losses as material for her own public narrative of suffering and strength. I want to be very clear about what I did next, because I think it matters, especially given the sensitivity of everything we're discussing. I did not post details of my miscarriages publicly. I did not exploit or expose my own medical history the way my mother had. What I did was expose her pattern of behavior, using her own words. Because I believed, after 2 violations, that the people in her orbit deserved to understand what was actually happening behind those sympathetic, prayerful posts. I took screenshots of both posts, the original one from months earlier that I'd saved before she took it down, and the vague new one from that week. I posted them side by side, not on a public page, but in a private family group chat that included my parents, my siblings, and a few close relatives who'd been present for both situations. Alongside the screenshots, I wrote a message explaining, calmly and factually, exactly what had happened both times, that I had explicitly asked my mother not to share news of my first pregnancy. that she had shared details of that loss publicly anyway, that I had not told anyone about the second pregnancy specifically to prevent this from happening again, and that she had apparently pieced together private medical information through shared banking access and posted about it regardless. I didn't ask anyone to take sides. I didn't ask for an apology tour. I simply asked that going forward, any medical information about me, in any form, would not be shared publicly by anyone in the family without my direct, explicit permission, and that the shared banking access from years earlier be removed immediately. Which it was, within an hour of that message being sent. My aunt, who had been one of the 200 people commenting sympathy on that first post, responded in the group chat, saying she'd had no idea any of this had happened without my consent, and that she felt genuinely uncomfortable realizing she'd unknowingly participated in something that violated my privacy. My mother didn't respond in the group chat at all that night. She called me the next morning, and this conversation was different from everyone that came before it. I think seeing her own words, side by side, laid out factually in front of family members whose opinions she actually cared about, did something that my private explanations of hurt feelings had never managed to do. She didn't cry this time. She said quietly, "I didn't realize how it looked, seeing it written out like that." I told her, as gently as I could manage while still being honest, that I understood her grief as a grandmother was real, that I'd never questioned that, but that grief doesn't give anyone the right to make someone else's private pain into public content. Especially content that generates sympathy and admiration directed at the person sharing it, rather than the person actually living through the loss. She asked, and I believe genuinely, what she should have done instead, if she needed support processing her own feelings about our losses. I told her the same thing I'd tried to tell her months earlier, but this time she seemed capable of actually hearing it, that she could call me, or a friend privately, or a therapist, or write in a journal. Any of the countless private ways people process grief without needing an audience of strangers to witness and validate it. It wasn't a perfect conversation. She didn't fully transform overnight into someone who processes things privately, because that's not really how people change, all at once, in a single phone call. But something did shift. She started asking before sharing things about any of us. She started slowly, building actual private support systems, instead of defaulting to public posts, every time something difficult happened in the family. It's been 1.5 years since that second miscarriage. Josh and I are currently expecting again, further along this time than either previous pregnancy, and this time, we made a specific rule with my parents before telling them anything, any sharing of any kind, in any form, about this pregnancy requires our direct permission first. Every single time. No exceptions. My mother has honored that boundary completely. It's a small thing maybe, asking permission before sharing basic updates. But after everything, it feels significant. It feels like the first real evidence that she understood, finally, that my experiences belong to me first, and to her narrative of herself as a devoted mother only if I choose to let them. I don't think what I did with those screenshots was about punishing her. I think it was about finally making sure that the actual pattern of what was happening, not just how I felt about it, but what had objectively occurred, twice without my consent, was something she couldn't minimize or reframe anymore. Because it was right there, in her own words, impossible to argue with. Grief is hard enough to carry privately. It becomes something else entirely when someone else decides to carry it publicly on your behalf, for an audience, for sympathy that was never actually about you to begin with. I don't share the details of my current pregnancy with anyone outside Josh and my closest friend, not because I don't trust my family anymore, but because I've learned, the hard way, twice, that some things are only truly yours if you're the one who decides when, and if, and how, they're told. If you've ever had someone take your private pain and make it about themselves, I hope this story reminded you that your grief belongs to you, and you're allowed to protect it, however you need to. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because next week I'm telling you about the mother-in-law who thought she controlled everything in her son's marriage, until she found out whose name was actually on the deed to her own house.